So I did some maintenance over the course of the weekend and swapped out the spark plugs, got rid of that air valve, installed the new rapid bike, and I also installed a new exhaust. It's the Axle SX1. The DB killer is quite restrictive on it. I didn't actually try the exhaust with the DB killer in it. I just saw it and decided to remove it. So once having removed it and then installed the exhaust, the exhaust may have a catalytic converter, but it is quite loud. So if you're worrying about not waking up your neighbors, you may want to leave the DB killer in that. As you can see, I have the spark plugs here. The part number for these is that. So that's the part number that was spoken about on the forum a couple times. Also cross-referenced in the manual, the service manual, and that is the proper spark plug, according to the manual anyway. So, these are in firing order, not firing order, rather, cylinder order, because the firing order is different. So this one being the one that would be on the left side, the rider's left side, is the first spark plug. And we'll see if I can get this to actually focus. And that's with about 14,000 miles on it. So if you're doing a lot of commuting, 14,000 miles is probably okay. If you're at the track every day, you're going to get probably wear numbers for your spark plugs that are closer to the 7,500 miles that Kawasaki recommends in the manual. This is number 2. So there's that. And there is some difference between the cylinders, which is kind of interesting. You can see as I get towards the right side of the bike and later in the firing order, the plugs are starting to pick up a little more junk up in the threads. It's probably just heat being dissipated through. I would, honestly, I expected 2 and 3 to look kind of like this one does, where the heat may have affected the coloring of the stainless or the steel or whatever they happen to make these things out of. And 1 and 4 to be not so much. But the interesting part is, I'll show you number 4. That's number 4. And even though it's not harshly discolored, it is discolored more than 1 and 2, which is kind of interesting. So, let's see if I can get that more closer. And that's generally what you're looking at. So, yeah, spark plug maintenance interval 14,000 seems reasonable, at least for me. I do more commuting on the bike than I do anything else. So, yeah, those numbers are pretty reasonable. I'm not taking this thing to track days. I don't have that kind of skill level, so I'm not gonna try. But yeah, if you're revving the piss out of it all the time, you may want to go with the Kawasaki 7,500 miles swap out. So the next part was this. This whole thing came out, and honestly, I had no clue how this system worked when I decided that I was going to bypass it as a result of putting an exhaust in, which is generally not a good way to go about things, but anyway, my stupidity aside. So the part that was actually a mystery to me was this. When I took these off, I totally expected to find something not too dissimilar from what I found. I expected a couple holes that led into the exhaust, and I expected this valve to actually open and close with the scavenging pulse. So I expected them to toggle this valve rapidly so that during the scavenging pulse they were opening up one of these areas here and bringing the air in from the intake, rather than leaving it wide open and having exhaust actually get pushed up into the intake, which may actually happen. But when I was running the bike with these on it and the intake removed, I didn't notice any exhaust coming out. I noticed there was a marked suction from this end of the tube. Well, this is kind of backwards. There we go, more like that. So when I was standing on the right side of the bike, I would be able to put my thumb over this and feel some suction. So these parts were a complete mystery to me. I didn't realize that they were going to be in there. I didn't know what they did, how they worked, or any of that matter. And I still really don't know how they work. They look like springs, they look like reed valves, but if you look closely, you'll see there's a small reed valve there. So as opposed to the valve toggling with the scavenging pulse, they don't do any of that timing, which kind of makes sense. There's no sense in wasting CPU power to toggle a valve. So what they did is they put these in, and this particular metal piece, which I thought was the spring, it stops the valve from extending too far. So if there's too much suction on the exhaust, it won't allow this valve to open up too far. So that kind of answers that question. As you can see, one's stuck in there, one's not. But despite using those valves, you do get some exhaust gook up in here. Yeah, there you go. And it is, I did notice there was a little bit of sediment or something stuck up in the lines here. So that's that, and that's how it went down and worked. One of the things I noticed with this off is when you're coming off the throttle and you're engine braking, if you give it just an ever slight bit of throttle, you'll notice that there's kind of like a burbling in the exhaust. So my guess is this system here, along with the factory catalytic converter. I mean, I've got a cat in the new exhaust, but the factory catalytic was a little bit more restrictive. Between the two, they made sure that all of the gas was burned off. There was no explosions after it left the cat, and that burbling that you're hearing is likely small pops of gas being burnt off. So that's how that went down. So if you have any questions, I guess ask them on the forum. I'll try to answer them as best I can, but there's a high probability I may not have the answer for that.